Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have had on this podcast we started 17 years ago. Some with ourselves, others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you enjoy them and want to support us and keep it all coming and get extra entertainment, including the weekly quiz and a special event on your birthday, visit patreon.com/wordinyour-ear or just like or subscribe in whatever way you prefer.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
Okay, Mark, we start with a kind of Stackwaddy game. It's a relation of a Stackwaddy game. And it's provoked by the news that the band formed by Bono's son, Elijah, you've probably heard this good news. The band is called Inhaler.
Yes. That's a good name.
No, it's not. So
I like it.
I'm going to tell you why.
Although it does end with ER, which is a bad thing.
This is what I'm going to come to.
Oh, okay.
So this provided me with the ideal opportunity to once more ventilate my theory that all bands whose names finish with ER are impossible to love. You know, this is a theory I first went into print with, I think, 45 years ago, Mark. So it's, you know,
it still holds up.
It's still holding up. You know, the kind of thing. Names that sound slightly machine-like.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Foreigner, Slayer. There's a group called Harvester as well.
Harvester. Toploader, Kingmaker.
Yeah,
right.
they all sound like compromises arrived at by not very imaginative white blokes in rehearsal rooms. Yeah, that'll do. That's all right. You know, and none of them have that kind of charisma. None of them have that property called flair. So, to mark the 45th birthday of my theory, okay, I've lined up here 7 real bands whose names all finish with ER, and you, Mark Ellen, are going to tell me who they are, okay? You ready?
What, whether they're real or...
No, you're going to tell me the names. You're going to tell me the names. Okay, we'll start with the first one. 70s folk group featuring Dave Stewart.
Oh, I know this.
Signed to Elton John's Rocket label.
I know this. They were called Longdancer.
Longdancer.
Not a terrible name.
No, it is, Mark. I'm sorry.
All right.
Okay, we're moving on.
Yeah, go on.
We're moving on. Number 2. Indie group formed in Hull in 1990. Indie group formed in Hull in 1990.
That probably is Toploader, but I'm not sure.
No, it's not. It's Kingmaker, Mark.
Oh, Kingmaker. That's right. With Kingmaker we mentioned before. Yeah.
Okay, right. The group formed by Ariel Bender, formerly Luther Grosvenor, featuring former Love Affair singer Steve Ellis. Do you remember them?
Oh, go on. I probably will when you say.
Widowmaker.
Oh, Widowmaker. I saw them. I saw Widowmaker. I think Hugh Lloyd Langton was the lead guitar player.
He probably was.
I saw them at Reading Festival.
Well, there you go. Here we go. Next one. English rock band formed in London, 1992. They had 8 UK top 40 singles and 3 UK top 10 albums during the 90s. My God, they were giving away chart placings with the green stamps in those days. Well, they go on.
What year was it again?
They formed in 1992. And they did well during the 90s. No?
Go on.
Sleeper.
Oh, God, Sleeper.
Here we go. Next one.
Very well known.
Welsh rock band formed in Newport, South Wales, 1994. Have released 12 studio albums. 12 studio albums. Probably more than the Beatles. Go on.
Welsh rock band, 1994.
Yeah. Feeder.
Of course, Feeder.
Oh, God, they get worse.
Oh, my Lord. Feeder's
Here
a terrible
we go.
name.
We're going across the
Although we're
Atlantic.
going back to Widowmaker, and that's a great name. But anyway, no, Feeder's a terrible name. Feeder.
No, it's a terrible... Widowmaker's a terrible name. American hard rock supergroup consisting of various former members of Guns N' Roses and former member of Wasted Youth and former member of Stone Temple Pilots. No, Velvet Revolver.
Yeah.
Imagine them going, Velvet Revolver, and somebody going, oh, that's good. That's really... No, it's not. And finally, we go back to 1975. group formed by Mike Pato and Ollie Helsel in 1975, signed to Virgin and released 3 albums, one called Below the Belt, which featured a naked woman on the cover with a boxing glove in her pubic area. They were called, Mark. Boxer!
Goodness sake, they were Boxer. I remember Boxer vividly. You've missed out a couple. You missed out Weezer. And I think you missed out Backstreet Crawler.
Oh, God, yes.
Weren't they the splinter group? There was I think it's a Paul Kossoff splinter group.
Paul Kossoff's group, yeah, Backstreet Crawler.
That's very good. I did really badly on that. It's funny how you can't see, because Feeder, it's staring in the face. I mean, Sleeper, huge, weren't they?
Yeah, well, I suppose so. Yeah,
Louise Wenner, I think so.
There's just something
Louise Wenner, even her name ends in ER.
There's just something about those names that makes my spirit sink. You know what I mean?
Something dully mechanical about it, isn't it?
There really is. They kind of appeal to boys, you know?
Yes.
Yeah, that's all right. I can write that on the back of my exercise book. You know, you can imagine them doing that.
Toploader.
On the back of that Toploader. Yeah. So anyway, no, Elijah Hewson's band is called Inhaler.
I think it's quite a good name.
No, Mark, I will not have that. It's a terrible, terrible name. And I'll meet you back here in a year's time, and you will agree with it.
The Word Podcast, prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
Dave, we were looking at a clip the other day of Kendrick Lamar coming out of the Super Bowl after his performance at halftime, which was richly funny. It was it's Kendrick Lamar surrounded by, I would estimate, something in the region of 20 security people, all of them lunging at probably imaginary cameras, almost saying, "No pictures, keep away," and surrounding with batons. Actually, no one could possibly get anywhere near this incredibly unprepossessing guy. I mean, he's just not very exciting to look at. There he is in his kind of regular, kind of baggy old. He looks like he works in a garage or something, doesn't he? But anyway. And they're hustling him out of there. And it just made me just look at that whole the whole Super Bowl incident. And I noticed something really interesting, which is that Drake, who is his huge professional enemy, as you know, they've had this beef running for about a year.
Well, they don't really. You might have to tell me about this.
Because Drake, on the same day as the Super Bowl, Drake was playing, in Melbourne. And in the concert, he gives $45,000 to 2 fans in 2 envelopes full of a brick of cash. And the reason he did this, obviously, is this is how you quite literally buy publicity, isn't it? He wanted to create something that would hopefully go viral and would hopefully get him a lot of publicity on the very day that Kendrick Lamar was going to be appearing at the Super Bowl, because Kendrick Lamar would almost certainly be mentioning him and the beef on stage, which indeed he did. And the beef, to sum it all up, started, I think, in October of 23, where Drake and J. Cole released a track called First Person Shooter, where Cole claims that he, Drake and Lamar are the big 3 in modern hip-hop, right? So Lamar's response comes with a track called Like That in March in 2024, claiming that hip-hop is just Big Me, okay? So this escalated very, very quickly. So Drake then releases Family Matters, accusing Lamar of domestic abuse and alleging that one of Lamar's children was actually fathered by the producer Dave Free. This is quite... This is not kind of John and Paul kind of trading insults, is it? It's not kind of...
Puts How Do You Sleep in its place, doesn't it, really?
No, it's not really, no. The next day, and then 20 minutes later, then Lamar then released Meet the Grahams, accusing Drake of sexual predation and sexual trafficking and fathering a second secret child. And then on the day after that, Not Like Us, Lamar then calls Drake a certified paedophile. I mean, this is pretty extraordinary stuff. Very, very, very aggressive indeed. Anyway, and Lamar comes on stage and he says, I want to play their favourite song, which he's referring to, Not Like Us, but I can't do that. Not Like Us was really successful, got 1 billion streams on Spotify, won 5 Grammy Awards. But he said, I won't be able to do it because, the lawyers won't like it. Eventually he does do it, and he leaves out the critical line about with the paedophile allegation. I'm just thinking, this is the most extraordinary thing. And this is how people sustain careers, by simply keeping themselves in the frame, isn't it? By having battles, by having grudges that they publicize.
But and actually, if you want a parallel, look no further than the Oval Office.
Yeah,
because there used to be a definition of a successful political career was you got through a press conference without having said anything controversial, without having released any hostages to fortune.
Yeah.
No, that's not what you do. What you do in the world of Donald Trump, of Vladimir Putin, and so forth. You be as provocative as possible, because what you want to do is just punch people all the time. That's what your followers relate to. That's
you
what
want to soak up all the interest so that no one else can get their viewpoint put across.
Well, also, and I don't think it's more than that. I think it's the kind of people identify with the bully in a big way, whereas they never used to. They seem to do at the moment. You know what I mean? Can I be dominant over another figure? Was I reading about Taylor Swift's grudges?
It's extraordinary, because she has an amazing reputation now as someone with an interminable capacity for spite, doesn't she? I mean, I'm very much like Taylor Swift, but I do think that.
Can I just say that that's a good name for an album? An interminable appetite for spite. I would buy that. Go on, carry on.
It is. It is. Because she's constantly having a go at any of, or particularly her romantic partners who have wronged her in the past. She wrote a song about a pop star who dumped her with a 25-second phone call. She about an actor who stood her up on her 21st birthday. A DJ who didn't credit her for a hit single that they co-wrote. I think, is it Jake Gyllenhaal and John Mayer, I think, have been respectively, have faced harassment and death threats from Swifties after she's mentioned them in songs.
Well, yeah.
She had a near decade-long feud with Katy Perry after Perry hired some of Swift's backup dancers. There's the huge dispute with Kanye West. Do you remember that, when Kanye West interrupted her acceptance speech at the VMAs? And he then claimed that he'd made her famous.
Talking of Kanye West, sorry, while you're stopping off on the subject of Kanye West, there was this extraordinary video that went viral in the last week of a bunch of prominent Jewish entertainers.
Oh, I saw that. Yes, Woody Allen and.
David Schwimmer. I can't remember who else. Scarlett Johansson. All giving Kanye West the finger while wearing a T-shirt. The T-shirt has a slogan, has a logo of somebody giving the finger. And I sent this to you, and I just thought, that's real. And of course, it's not, is it? It's AI.
Well, the only thing I thought was when some of them, David Schwimmer and Lisa Kudrow, are both in it, and they look quite young. It doesn't look as though it's contemporary footage.
Right. No,
but I figured this must have been done by AI, but all these people would have given their approval and said, you can do that, you can put this T-shirt. But they hadn't. They hadn't even been consulted. So you just go ahead and do these things. By the time people complain about it, it's too late. It's gone, and you may take it down. I don't even think there's a legal dimension to this at all.
The only thing I found myself thinking afterwards was, who are the prominent Jewish entertainers who are not there? Because Bob Dylan's not there, is he?
No, he's not.
Which, when you think, well, they did it without permission, why wasn't he
there?
Yeah. He'd probably object on the grounds that he ought to be there. Kanye West, sorry, I was interrupting you and going through the list of Taylor Swift's beefs. But it just shows how it's kind of an infectious thing, isn't it, nowadays? If you've not got a feud, you're nobody. You got to have a feud, So they're like, contemporary pop stars. They're like hillbillies, in the Beverly Hillbillies.
Taking pot shots at each other on opposite hilltops, knocking lumps out of each other with old flintlock rifles.
Oh, dear God. Why were we talking about cartoons?
Well, we're talking about Taylor Swift, and I think there's another interesting thing, just how she's just, I mean, in a way, it's one of those things where, we've had this conversation before, you can't write songs about things that are divisive, you can't write songs about things that are political or campaigning or whatever, because, I mean, it's going to split your audience. Whereas if you write songs about things that happen in your own life, no one can really complain about it. That's your issue and that's your prerogative, But no, at a sideline, I was listening to the Giddy Carousel of Pop podcast, which is really, really good. It's been running for some time, and it's a kind of celebration of everything to do with smash hits. And the latest guest they had on was Miranda Sawyer, who is fantastic. I mean, she's just so funny and interesting and revelatory. And she talks about, at one point, she throws in little theories all the way through, and she said, she's talking about theories about pop stars in the 90s, and says, all the great pop stars, she says, can be instantly rendered as a cartoon. They have a signature, they have a characteristic or a signature about their look, which means that in 5 seconds you can draw a cartoon of them, which is identifiable. And the reason she said this was she was talking about Taylor Swift, and that Taylor Swift said you can't make a cartoon of Taylor Swift. And I thought that was quite an interesting point. I think one of it is because Taylor Swift is actually quite conventional looking. Taylor Swift's just a very, very pretty, tall girl with grey hair, but there's no particular. You could probably do it with cowboy boots and a guitar or something, but there's no characteristic about her. Whereas most pop stars are actually very unusual and very quirky looking. It's completely different from being a film star. If you look at film stars, look at, say, Brad Pitt or Gwyneth Paltrow. Those are people that are incredibly attractive, even if you didn't know anything about them. And George Clooney, these are people you see in films, you just think they're really, really beautiful. Pop stars is a completely different thing because it's to do with your understanding of who they are, and it's to do with what they represent. And that's what makes them attractive, because, Jack White, if you saw a picture of Jack White, you would say he would never make a pop star. Björk, Jarvis Cocker, do you know what I mean? Keith Richards, Lady Gaga, Billie Eilish, Annie Lennox. I mean, all these people, fabulous looking, but they're unusual looking, don't you think? Debbie Harry. She's gorgeous, but her head's too big.
If you go to the cartoons, it's interesting. You were talking to me about this, and I was thinking back to the times when the Melody Maker used to regularly run caricatures of pop names done by a guy called Lon Goddard. Yeah. And they used to very often dominate the letters page, I think, or maybe they used to have a thing called Blind Date where people used to review the singles without knowing who they were by. And it reminded me of how, people generally who are big names had one instantly recognizable feature. Mick Jagger was always an enormous mouth, Yeah,
huge lips.
Debbie Harry was a kind of wide head. Slightly Venusian looking, Paul McCartney was a huge eyes, And then there was those people who always had a prop, So Alice Cooper, there would always be a snake nearby or something, And there were those people that it was easier to do that with, And actually the first case of this goes way back to the 50s, which is Buddy Holly. Once you did the specs with Buddy Holly, you'd introduce the idea of Buddy Holly and Freddie Mercury and the jaw and all that kind of thing. But it's interesting what you should say about, because when you're talking about the fact that rock stars there's something about them that looks slightly weird. One of the things I found naggingly unsatisfactory about A Complete Unknown, the Bob Dylan film, is that they look like actors. They don't look like rock stars. You look at
they're almost too beautiful.
Bob Dylan, they're too beautiful. Yeah. I saw a picture this week of the woman who played Joan Baez posing with Joan Baez. And for a start, she's about 2 feet taller than the real Joan Baez. Now, I know the real Joan Baez is a woman probably in her 80s now or something. You know? But it did remind the Bob Dylan, he was just kind of odd and slightly baby faced, Yeah. And anybody who's famous enough to have been cast as Bob Dylan is going to be too good looking to be Bob Dylan. And I think that would apply to pretty much all those people in those kind of positions, because
it's completely true. Because again,
only
Bob Dylan. If you had a picture of Bob Dylan in 1963, you would have thought that guy's never going to make it as a film star, because it's all to do with what you represent. It's all to do with it's your relationship with that person, and what they mean to you and what their songs are about. It's not just the way they look; it's a completely different package. But I've written down here, Dave.
Go on.
I've written down here just a few words. It's a word association.
All right.
A few things. People who have single characteristics that you can identify them by. And you're going to guess who they could be when rendered in cartoon form. Okay. Who would this be then? And the clue is 18-inch platform shoes.
Well, I don't know. Is that Dave Hill out of Slade?
Lady Gaga, I think.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
A swan.
A swan. God, remind me. Go on.
Swan. Do you remember the swan dress, Björk?
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
Good, a single glove.
Well, of course, that's Michael Jackson.
It is, yeah. Just ginger hair.
Well, Mick Hucknall.
Mick Hucknall. Actually, that's true. I was thinking of Ed Sheeran, actually. Yeah. A brass bra.
Oh, God, where's the Madonna? Surely.
Yeah. Rectangular shades.
Well, God,
Could
now we were talking about Mike Ratledge only the other week, weren't we? But I suppose Roger McGuinn had those those kind of Dickensian pawnbroker specs, didn't he? That he used to peer through.
Comedy specs.
Well, Elton, surely.
Yeah, I think so. As a lightning stripe across the face.
Well, it's David Bowie. There you go. It's,
and a bat. But just a bat.
Is that Ozzy Osbourne?
Ozzy Osbourne. I think so. You could somehow do it. As long as there's a bat involved in that 5-second cartoon, you get it across. Yeah. But people it made me think people just have those trademarks, don't they? It's like Adele. You think, does Adele have a trademark? She sort of does. She wears ball gowns, doesn't she?
Yes, I suppose.
Adele's always in a ball gown. You never see her.
Now, I've got a question. For anybody who's anybody listening who's the owner of a 12-year-old child or something like that. We used to draw pop stars on the back of exercise books. Does anybody still do that? I want to know. Does anybody still do that? Or is that just too old tech to doodle your favorite pop star on the back of an exercise book? I used to draw the Beatles regularly. Did you?
Yeah, and it was very easy to draw them, really. It was just 4 haircuts, wasn't it?
Yes.
4 haircuts. One of them had a big nose coming out the front.
And a drum saying the Beatles.
I used to draw the Beatles.
Job done, cables going to amplifiers in the background if you wanted to get into more detail. Bring it all back. Exercise book art. We want to see it.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
And now, have you seen about Buffy Sainte-Marie and the Order of Canada, which is the great Canadian honour, which she was presented with? It's now been revoked by the Governor General of Canada on account of her not being quite as native North American as you may have allowed the world to think in the past.
And I thought that was interesting because you can't tell whether that's her back in the 1970s positioning herself firmly as kind of Native American or journalists and media picking up on that aspect of her ancestry and deciding to exaggerate it and her just going along with it because obviously it did her a lot of good, didn't it? I mean, it's what gave her a lot of attention. I really remember that.
Certainly gave her a lot of attention. Although, to be fair, she'd had some big hits. Didn't she write, what was it, Up Where We Belong or something like that? Is that from Officer and Gentleman? Was that one of those songs? I don't know. I got that wrong. Universal Soldier and all that stuff going back to the 60s. But it was, it was one of those things that the kind of default position on publicity about Buffy Sainte-Marie was always, she's native, North I would say American or North American or whatever, the appropriate term. And it just struck me, if you had a career as long as that, it seems a terrible shame for a thing like that to happen, in her later years, the kind of dishonor. There was a CBC, which is Canadian Broadcasting Company, big documentary about this, expose about this apparently. Anyway, so
I felt sorry for her, actually. And it's an interesting thing because a lot of the time it may not have been her fault at all.
Yeah,
another example, just at a tangent, is C6 Steve. C6 Steve, when he started, gave all his interviews, and he said, they said, well, tell us about your life. He said, oh, my life's really interesting. He said, I had a long period where actually I was just hopping freight trains and living like a hobo and, firing up the canned heat and boiling up tins of beans. And then I went to Europe and I worked for a while as a disco producer and I was in a band that was on Top of the Pops and I did a lot of production and session work, and now I finished up, playing this old blues stuff on a knackered old 3-string guitar and this, that and the other, and the press, he did actually say all that. And the press just decided they would pick, which I can understand, decided they'd pick on the really glamorous and interesting good story aspect of that, which is old hobo jumping freight trains, and they kind of erased the rest of that story, which he had told people. And now, to some extent, I don't know how much of a fight he put up about trying to remind people that he did all these things, but he did tell them, and then, of course, it all came back to haunt him because people turned around and said, he's a fraud. Suddenly someone said, do you realise C6 Steve actually was a disco producer in the 1970s and 80s? And, he's an absolute fraud. He hasn't spent his entire life living in rail yards, cooking around, an old wood smoke fire, And I felt a bit sorry for him, really.
So anyway, I thought in the light of Buffy Sainte-Marie's, unfortunate, revoking of the Order of Canada, we ought to make the following things clear about other popular music names. That, Bob Dylan was never a hobo, was he? Not ever. Not ever.
Was John Lennon a working class hero?
I don't think he was. Was Elton John ever bisexual? I'm not sure he was. I think he was. He voted the straight gay ticket pretty much all the way through his career. There may have been times when he was less frank about it than others, but that's the way he was. You can go further. I don't think Bruce Springsteen was ever a tramp, was he?
I don't think he was. Not a tramp. I think that's an enormous. Tramps like us? Are you sure?
A tramp like you? I don't think so. I don't think
Bob
so.
Marley?
No. Did he shoot the sheriff? No.
There's no concrete evidence
it cannot
absolutely conclusively prove that he ever shot a sheriff.
And a visual sighting of David Bowie will make it clear that he was thin and he was undoubtedly white. A duke? I don't think so. Do you think so?
Okay. I raise you Joe Strummer.
God.
Daddy was a bank robber. Was he a bank robber? Or was he actually a diplomat? Sending his son to a boarding school in the southern counties. I don't think he was a bank robber. I may be wrong.
No.
I don't know.
Definitely not. Yeah,
Wheatus, I think the member of Wheatus probably was a teenage dirtbag. I'll go along with that.
Right.
I'm asking you, did Starship ever actually physically, literally build a city out of rock and roll?
No.
I don't think they did.
If they've done so, it's been knocked down since, because it's not there.
You raised the ground. And something more substantial has been put up in its place. I don't know. I mean, you could go off at tangents and say, I don't think Robert Plant was from the land of ice and snow and from the midnight sun where the hot springs flow. He's actually from West Bromwich and Stafford.
West Bromwich.
I don't know. But anyway, look, if anyone's got any more suggestions, this is good, isn't it?
Oh, it's very good.
Bob Marley did not shoot any sheriffs. We want more of these.
The Word Podcast, driving the digital kids to school since 2007.
I'm reading this from a WhatsApp exchange you and I had earlier this week, because that's how we record absolutely everything. I've been listening to a discussion on the radio about Morgan McSweeney, the man who is the kind of eminence grise of the Labour Party and the man who appears to operate Keir Starmer. And they're all saying, apparently, there is no audio of him, which I thought was
bizarre.
in this day and age was vaguely spooky. It's kind of, it doesn't leave an imprint on the tape or whatever.
Leaves no shadow, like a vampire.
And it just struck me how, I mean, obviously it's incredibly rare nowadays for anybody not to have absolutely everything they do recorded in one way or another. But obviously in the past, and maybe think about the past in the early days of recording. And so if you go to a broadcasting house in London now, they've proudly erected a quite impressive statue of their former employee, George Orwell, just near the entrance there. And of course, the great irony about George Orwell, the kind of one of the most revered and influential, media operatives of the 20th century, is although he worked at the BBC for some years, there is no recording of George Orwell.
No, we can't hear his voice, can we?
Which is quite remarkable.
Yeah, it is.
Really.
It's incredible.
For somebody who traded in opinions, so prominently for years. And if you go back in the early days of jazz, the great figure of New Orleans jazz was a cornet player called Buddy Bolden. And there's no surviving recording of Buddy Bolden. So Louis Armstrong and the likes and King Oliver heard Buddy Bolden, but there is no remaining recording of him. And I think there's a famous song called I thought I heard Buddy Bolden play, or something like this. I find it very attractive, that idea of somebody that isn't quite captured. There's no recording.
You mean there's no recording of his voice or his music?
Or his music, of anything.
His music, that's amazing. That's extraordinary.
There's no recording of Scott Joplin. I mean, there are piano rolls that he kind of authored, but there's no
people playing Scott Joplin. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's no recording of him. But when you think that there is actually audio of Queen Victoria.
There is. You can hear that. I mean, it's very badly damaged, but it exists. There's one of Florence Nightingale. This is way back. There's Gladstone, I think.
I think
Brahms.
But not
James
Disraeli.
Joyce, obviously.
Gladstone,
that's quite
but
recent.
not Disraeli. Yes.
Yeah.
Brahms.
Samuel Beckett, Tchaikovsky. You can hear them speaking.
You can hear them. But then you got
people who don't exist. In fact, the first people recorded, I think, were Caruso, Nellie Melba, and Rachmaninoff, I think, were the very first ones. That you can't hear people like Van Gogh, people who, just, not that he was well enough known anyway.
Well, yeah, absolutely. He would have lived in obscurity.
So he wasn't well known, but that he died pretty much at the birth of that kind of sound recording. But the one that you mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, that there is no record, well, apart from Thomas Pynchon, I think. And Salinger, I wasn't surprised, because Salinger was a kind of
recluse.
But not a hermit, as the right, a recluse, wasn't he? I mean, he lived, in the backwoods for the rest of his life, really, after the initial success. But the other one was Banksy. There is apparently no sound recording of Bowie, which is understandable, because his whole concept is to be anonymous and invisible.
Yeah. But also Florence Foster Jenkins.
Yes.
Who was, world famous for her terrible singing that used to sell out concert halls. There's apparently no surviving recording of Florence Foster Jenkins.
Which makes me think that her husband, which is really interesting, her husband who bankrolled the whole thing, she had a very rich husband, and her great desire was to be recognised as a famous singer. And that's why he promoted her, didn't he? And he got in the voice coach and put on the concerts and paid for everything. But deep down, he must have known she was no good. Otherwise, he would have got her to make a record. Don't you think?
Greater love, eh? Greater love.
Greater love, exactly. I know.
So our birthday Patreon guest this week is somebody who's got something in common with me.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
Okay, our special birthday guest, Patreon guest this week, is a man who will probably back me up in one of my favourite theories, which is that if you're born in 1950, you have the winning ticket in the lottery of life as far as pop music is concerned. This is a theory I've tested out on fellow people who were born in 1950, such as Steve Van Zandt. Do you agree, Chris Lintott?
Yeah, 1950, great year for people. You, me, Steve Van Zandt, but a rubbish year for wine.
Oh dear.
Yeah. Well, you have to put these things into perspective.
So Chris had a birthday party the other day, which was fortunate enough to, well, we were all invited to, but I managed to get there because everybody else was out of the country or otherwise engaged. And it was great fun, Chris. Nice to see you. Did you have a good time? I came away inspired. I came home and told my wife that you'd tell the story about you weren't going to mark the birthday until somebody suggested you ought to do it. Then you thought, nobody will turn up, will they? But then they did turn up. And you actually finished by saying, in 5 years' time, put it in your diary, I shall be here for my 80th. Is that fair?
Well remembered. Yes, right. Indeed.
Oh, yeah, it was a good speech. I remember all of it. So Chris, what we it's customary on these occasions for our guests, our birthday guests, to sort of throw a log on the smouldering embers of Word in Your Ear. And I believe yours concerns some of the people that you saw back in the day when you were a young whippersnapper. Is that fair?
Well, before we get on to that, I was thinking about gigs I've been to where people have said something unfortunate or indeed amusing. And looking back to 1966, at the much lamented Atalanta Ballroom in Woking, where I went to see Cream. Wow. And at the end of the second set, because this was in the great days when bands used to play 2 sets, Eric Clapton says, we're off on our first American tour at the end of this week, so this is the last time we'll be playing in Woking for a long time. We'd like to do a song from our first album. It's called I'm So Glad.
Oh, no. So they leave the stage with a hail of bottles.
Did they ever come back to Woking?
I don't think they did.
No, probably didn't. Yeah,
then a friend and I went to go and see the Searchers at the Mean Fiddler in the late 80s. And they came on stage and did all the usual stuff about, welcome, glad you could come down to the show. And they said, what an honour it is to play a venue named after our manager.
Very good, very good. You saw David Bowie in the early days, did you?
Well, very early is when he was doing mime with the Lindsay Kemp troupe. Mime, which I've always thought is one of the less interesting art forms.
Dave and I agree with that. Somehow the soul shrivels.
It just does.
Mime doesn't seem to be... It doesn't seem to expand the world.
Why are you doing this?
Things retract.
And that led me on to think about other people I'd seen before they became famous. And the 1966 Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival, where Bluesology featuring Stuart A. Brown were playing, and they had a rather podgy pianist who did actually seem to be quite a decent man on the 88s. And 10 years later, he was Elton John.
He was Reg.
That's
Reg.
Good.
Turned into Elton John.
Then.
I still think the transformation of Reg to Elton is one of those most remarkable things in the history of popular music, because he schlepped around with Long John Baldry for years, didn't he? Long John Baldry had a big hit, Let the Heartaches Begin and all that, was playing Chicken in the Basket circuit, Stockton-on-Tees and so forth. They had a miserable tour of Scotland and the North East. They arrived back in London, and Reg said to the rest of the band, I'm leaving now. I'm going to be called Elton John. Can you imagine the
hollow laughter?
Well,
I saw that first tour,
isn't it?
I saw his first tour, the Guildford Civic, and he was there with his stack-heeled boots and his fringed jacket, doing handstands on the piano key. It was fantastic.
It was an extraordinary transformation.
It was really good, totally transformed, and with the trio. He was just
extraordinary. Wonderful. Yeah. Who else? Who else have you got, Chris?
Well, in 1967, in the summer, I went to a club in Gerrard Street in Soho called Happening 44, where Sam Gopal's Indian Dream
Sam Gopal!
Wow. And their guitarist was one in Kilmister.
Oh, my goodness.
Lemmy.
That's great.
Lemmy, indeed.
Yeah. That's
former rockin' vicar.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. Sam Gopal, I haven't thought about them for a long time. Well, they were a standard fixture on all kind of Ladbroke Grove benefits in the late 60s, weren't
Yep.
they?
Yeah, he was Ladbroke Grove, wasn't he?
Quintessence, Sam Gapal, probably Bridget and John would be on there somewhere.
And the Exploding Galaxy.
Yeah.
I could never see the point of them, but they were always there.
And
That's
a Liquid Light show that'd probably be involved, wouldn't it?
Liquid Lens, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, possibly. I thought generally people just had a Liquid Light show where they used to just spill chemicals on the slide, didn't they? Isn't that how it worked? You know, I hate to say we made our entertainment
hot and sort of disintegrate on the screen, which was interesting to watch.
Yeah, things would just sort of bubble, wouldn't they? And melt.
Oh, yeah.
Cosmic. That's good.
Yeah. So
any others?
Did you see anybody where you thought, well, I'm going to be hearing more of them in due course?
I was a big fan of a band called Tomorrow in 1968.
Steve Howe.
That's Keith West.
Yeah,
who proceeded to go absolutely nowhere, although, of course, Steve Howe went on to Yes, as you say.
This is it, yes. And who else was in Tomorrow? I can't remember.
Twink was the drummer.
Twink,
Pink Fairies.
Later, the Fairies.
Oh, God, the Pink Fairies. Fantastic.
You couldn't get away from them at one time. You ever went to a festival? First group
Even if you tried.
Yeah,
we were trying to think about who we'd seen in kind of quite modest circumstances. And the best one I can think of was I saw the Jam at the Hope and Anchor in Islington. And the Hope and Anchor, you know, when it was full, took about 60 people. Well, it was not full that evening, you know. So it was the Jam probably in front of 20, 25 people. I still think about that, you know.
Oh, well, I can top that.
Go on.
Same venue.
Yeah.
Charlie Gillett played a demo by Dire Straits on his Honky Tonk show. And said, they're playing at the Hope and Anchor this evening. And so I went along, and there weren't even 30 people there, 20 people there.
Yeah.
And they were absolutely fabulous.
Yeah.
They really were.
Yeah.
I've learned
that Mark Knopfler, in between songs, had to show his brother David how to fret the chords for the next song.
So the friction had started.
A family venture.
Yes, absolutely.
I learned in terms of interviewing bands that there were only two people I saw who went on to be famous. They're very small scale, really. One was John Moss of Culture Club, who was the drummer of a punk band I interviewed called The Edge. And the other was Kevin Rowland when he was in a band called The Killjoys, where he wore kind of jodhpurs on stage, a kind of soul punk band. And I made the mistake of asking both of them in these interviews about saying, I saw you when you were in The Killjoys, or I saw you in The Edge. Of course, they never want to talk about it.
They don't want
That's
to.
the last thing they want to talk about. I thought that would be a really bonding thing. Oh, yeah, were you there?
Why don't they want to have a heritage?
No. They want to say that they've just reinvented themselves. They've started from scratch. The idea they had any failed past hovering over them was not.
They've got to give the impression that they were somehow raised by wolves.
Yeah.
You know, they were just kind of fully formed. You know,
just leapt out of the box, dressed as.
They didn't schlep around. You know, I mean that's the thing where we were. Well, you were at that thing, that David Bowie thing that we did the other night, Chris, weren't you?
Yeah.
With John Mendelsohn was talking about. You know, David Bowie playing in at some sort of party in the Hollywood Hills in 1971. And he said he was amazed that he couldn't read a room. He couldn't work out that it wasn't going down very well. And the interesting thing, it always intrigues me about Bowie when you talk about the miming and so forth, that David Bowie has this reputation, which grew up over the years, as being the man who could always see the future. Well, no, he couldn't. Not for years. You know what I mean? He blundered around like absolutely everybody else, didn't he?
Yeah, but on the other hand, your interview with Woody Woodmansey the other day did indicate that he was filtering everything, analysing everything.
Except the other thing that came out of the Woody Woodmansey thing, I meant to mention it to Mark afterwards, actually, which is one of the interesting points about John Mendelsohn, who is kind of agnostic about David Bowie, isn't he? He says David Bowie's as good as his collaborators, And I think that's a really good point, And so without Mick Ronson, David Bowie doesn't happen. I would have thought, without Tony Visconti, without Brian Eno,
yes, for sure.
Without Nile Rodgers, all kinds of people.
But that's true of so many people. As in Madonna,
yeah, I'm sure
is a
it is.
good example. Madonna just surrounded herself with the right. That was her genius, was finding the right people who could write songs and produce her.
Or people who could kind of cut to the chase. That Nile Rodgers, the great story about Nile Rodgers and David Bowie's Let's Dance is Nile Rodgers had brought in there, and this is a tune called Let's Dance, and Nile Rodgers listened to it once and said, start with the chorus. And once you've started with the chorus, the rest of the thing just completely falls into place, So there's a great benefit to having those kind of people involved in. Otherwise, you're mucking about forever. Trying to work out.
Story about the Grateful Dead recordings when all their mates would come in and say, I really hear a tambourine on this track. And so that would go in. And then, a triangle.
Yes.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Pile it in.
Strong stuff, this.
Tea. Well, the Grateful Dead changed everything, didn't they? Because their first few albums did nothing at all, didn't they? And Warner Brothers were just throwing fortunes at them, and then nothing was working. And then they just went off and wrote and recorded "Working Man's Dead" and "American Beauty." And they did everything first. They rehearsed it first. They were ready when they went in the studio and did it in a completely different fashion. And that worked for them.
Yeah, with all those 3-part harmonies. And a completely different record, that actually.
There's different band.
Totally
You'd
different
never
band.
guess.
Yeah.
If you listen to those earlier records, then you listen to American
We're talking
Beauty.
about 3-part harmonies. You two will know the answer to this. I read somewhere that the Beatles, the great secret was they sang 3 parts of a 4-part harmony. So you, the listener, could join in with the extra part.
Oh, God.
Oh, right.
Over to you,
4-part
Mark.
harmony is pretty rare, actually. So that's very sophisticated. So we should go back and listen to Because this evening and see if we can invent the missing line. Maybe we should.
Well,
It sounds like the kind of story that just gathers around the Beatles and doesn't gather around anybody else at all.
And we're going to perpetuate it.
We're having learned
What did
it
Paul
from you,
McCartney say
Chris.
about the Beatles? There are 1,000 stories about the Beatles, and all of them
And
are
they're
true.
all true.
That's right.
Yes, that's true. Well, look, Chris, lovely to talk to you.
thank you very much for having me.
And on the occasion of your birthday, and I hope the celebrations continue. And we look forward to seeing you next year.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.